In August 1882, an African king walked into Queen Victoria's palace and did something that shocked the entire British establishment. He'd written letters. Passionate, eloquent letters pleading for justice, for recognition, for the survival of his kingdom. And for a brief, shining moment, it almost worked. This is the story of how diplomacy nearly saved an empire, and how the British chose conquest over conversation. Hit that subscribe button, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about the British Empire. King Cetshwayo kaMpande wasn't just any African ruler. Born around 1826 into the Zulu royal family, he grew up watching his kingdom become one of the most powerful military forces in southern Africa. When his father King Cetshwayo died in 1872, Cetshwayo took the throne of a nation that could field an army of 40,000 to 60,000 warriors, a sophisticated military machine that made even the British nervous. But here's what most people don't know: Cetshwayo didn't want war with Britain. He wanted partnership. He believed in diplomacy. He thought two great powers could coexist. He was a talented diplomat who understood that the future of his kingdom depended on navigating the treacherous waters of imperial politics. And for a while, he was right. The Zulu Kingdom in the 1870s was extraordinary. It wasn't some primitive tribal society that Victorian Britain liked to imagine existed in Africa. This was an organized state with political structures, military regiments, economic systems, and diplomatic protocols. The Zulus had defeated rival kingdoms, established trade networks, and created a society that functioned with remarkable efficiency. Cetshwayo ruled over territories that stretched across what's now KwaZulu-Natal, commanding the loyalty of millions of people. But he had a problem. The British were coming. By the late 1870s, Britain's imperial ambitions in southern Africa had reached a fever pitch. They discovered diamonds at Kimberley. Gold would soon be found on the Witwatersrand. And suddenly, southern Africa wasn't just a backwater, it was potentially the richest region on Earth. The British had a vision: confederation. One unified British-controlled southern Africa that would include the Cape Colony, Natal, the Boer republics, and every African kingdom in between. There was just one problem. Independent African kingdoms like the Zulu nation stood in the way. And the British High Commissioner, a man named Sir Bartle Frere, had decided that the Zulu Kingdom had to go. Cetshwayo saw the storm coming. He'd watched the British annex the Transvaal in 1877. He'd observed how they manufactured crises to justify military intervention. He knew that if he gave them an excuse, they'd take it. So he tried diplomacy. He sent messages. He offered negotiations. He promised peace. He did everything a reasonable leader could do to avoid conflict. And then, in December 1878, the British delivered an ultimatum that was designed specifically to be impossible to accept. The ultimatum was breathtaking in its arrogance. Cetshwayo had to disband the Zulu army within 30 days. The entire military system that had taken generations to build, that was central to Zulu society and culture, that provided order and security, had to be dismantled immediately. He had to accept British missionaries and officials into Zululand, effectively surrendering his sovereignty. He had to pay reparations for alleged border violations that were either trivial or fabricated. And he had to do all of this without negotiation, without compromise, without any recognition that he was the legitimate ruler of an independent kingdom. It was an ultimatum designed not to be accepted, but to provide a pretext for war. Cetshwayo didn't respond by the deadline of December 31st. Bartle Frere extended it to January 11, 1879. Cetshwayo still didn't comply, not because he was being stubborn, but because complying would have meant the end of Zulu independence. On January 11th, British forces crossed the border and invaded Zululand. The war Cetshwayo had desperately tried to avoid had begun. What happened next stunned the world. On January 22, 1879, at a place called Isandwana, the Zulu army inflicted one of the worst defeats in British military history. 20,000 Zulu warriors attacked a British camp defended by about 1,800 troops. When the battle ended, over 1,300 British soldiers, colonial volunteers, and African auxiliaries lay dead. The Zulus had fought with spears and shields against rifles and artillery, and they'd won. News of the defeat reached London on February 11th and caused absolute panic. The invincible British army had been humiliated by an African kingdom. The empire's prestige was shattered. But here's the tragic irony. The Zulu victory at Isandwana destroyed Cetshwayo's hopes for peace. Before the battle, the British government in London hadn't been fully briefed about Frere's aggressive intentions. Many politicians thought the war was unnecessary and unjust. After Isandwana, none of that mattered. Britain had to save face. Reinforcements poured into southern Africa. The second invasion was massive, methodical, and merciless. On July 4, 1879, at the Battle of Ulundi, British forces defeated the Zulu army decisively. Cetshwayo's capital was burned. His kingdom was broken. On August 28, he was captured in the Ngome forest and sent into exile at Cape Town. And that's when Cetshwayo did something remarkable. He started writing letters. Sitting in captivity at the Cape, watching his kingdom be carved up into 13 separate chieftainships by British administrators who were deliberately trying to fragment Zulu power, Cetshwayo composed eloquent appeals to anyone in Britain who might listen. He wrote to Queen Victoria. He wrote to government ministers. He wrote to sympathetic missionaries and humanitarian activists. His message was consistent and powerful. He had never wanted war, the British had provoked the conflict, his people were suffering under the new system, and he could restore order if given the chance. The war, he insisted, had been a calamity, a tragedy that benefited no one. And incredibly, people started listening. The Earl of Kimberley, a senior British official, called Cetshwayo a remarkable man with great influence over his people. Activists who opposed imperial expansion took up his cause. Newspapers began questioning whether the war had been just. The newly elected Liberal government under Prime Minister William Gladstone, which had campaigned partly on opposing aggressive imperialism, decided to reconsider Cetshwayo's case. In August 1882, 3 years after his capture, Cetshwayo was allowed to travel to London to personally plead for his restoration. The visit was extraordinary. Cetshwayo arrived at Southampton on August 4 and was greeted by massive crowds. He stayed at a house in Kensington that had to be modified for his needs. Thousands of Londoners gathered outside hoping to catch a glimpse of the Zulu king. The press coverage was intense. Here was the man whose warriors had defeated British forces at Isandlwana, now walking the streets of London in European clothing, conducting himself with what contemporary accounts described as natural grace and dignity. He became a social phenomenon, compared to Caractacus, the ancient British king who had resisted Roman conquest. The British public was fascinated. On August 14, 1882, Cetshwayo met Queen Victoria at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. The meeting lasted only 13 minutes, but it was loaded with symbolic significance. Victoria's advisors had cautioned her against being too friendly with the man whose warriors had killed so many British soldiers. But Victoria was impressed. She wrote in her journal that Cetshwayo was a very fine man, that she recognized him as a great warrior who had fought against Britain, but rejoiced that they were now friends. She respected him as a brave enemy. She presented him with an ornate silver loving cup. She commissioned her personal portrait painter to create his image. It was, by all appearances, a royal encounter between equals. But appearances were deceiving. When Cetshwayo met with government officials, he learned the truth. Yes, they would allow him to return to Zululand. No, he wouldn't be restored to full power. His kingdom would be reduced. Chiefs who had collaborated with the British during the war would keep their territories. He'd rule over only a portion of what had once been his. He'd have no army to defend himself. The British had listened to his letters, granted him an audience with the Queen, and then gave him back a shadow of what he'd lost. Cetshwayo returned to Zululand in January 1883. Within months, civil war erupted as pro-British chiefs challenged his authority. His capital at Ulundi was attacked. He was wounded and forced to flee. He sought refuge in a British reserve, the ultimate humiliation for a king who had once ruled independently. On February 8, 1884, less than 2 years after meeting Queen Victoria, Cetshwayo died at Isho. The official cause was a heart attack, though some suspected poisoning. His kingdom would never be independent again. So why did Cetshwayo's diplomatic mission fail? Why did his letters, his eloquence, his appeal to Queen Victoria herself, not save his kingdom? Because the British Empire was never interested in partnership with African kingdoms. It was interested in control. Frere and other imperial administrators had manufactured the crisis specifically to destroy Zulu independence, and nothing Cetshwayo could say or write would change that fundamental goal. The letters, the visit to London, the audience with Victoria, all of it was theatre. The British government allowed Cetshwayo to plead his case because it made them look magnanimous, but they'd already decided the outcome. Here's what this story reveals about empire: African rulers tried diplomacy. Cetshwayo wasn't some savage warrior who only understood violence, as Victorian propaganda suggested. He was a sophisticated political leader who understood international relations, who tried every peaceful avenue before war, who continued trying even after defeat. His letters to Victoria and British officials were articulate, reasoned, and moving. They appealed to justice, to honor, to the possibility of mutual respect between nations. And they were ignored, not because they weren't compelling, but because the empire had already decided that African independence was incompatible with British interests. The tragedy is that Cetshwayo was right. The fragmented Zululand that the British created after 1879 was politically unstable, prone to civil wars, and ultimately no easier to govern than the unified kingdom had been. The confederation scheme that Frere had used to justify the war never materialized. The war cost British lives and money for minimal gain. A negotiated relationship with a strong, independent Zulu kingdom might actually have served British interests better than conquest. But empire doesn't think that way. Empire sees independent African power as inherently threatening, regardless of whether that power is hostile or friendly. This is why history matters. We remember Isandlwana as a famous battle. We remember Cetshwayo as the Zulu king who defeated the British. But we forget that he tried everything to avoid that battle, that he spent years after his defeat trying to rebuild through diplomatic channels, that he believed genuine partnership between African and European powers was possible. We forget that empire didn't fail to hear African voices. It heard them perfectly well. It just chose conquest anyway. If this story opened your eyes, if you're realizing that history is way